You're listening to Development Works, produced by Doctors for Doctors and Nurses for Nurses. Hello friends, I'm Andrew Wilson.
And I'm Michael Carlson. This is Development Works for February 2017. And on today's upcast...
When doing international development, the best organizations get knocked down and get back up again.
We hear from Dr. Brian Budgell, the president of a Canadian charity and a tenacious chocolatier.
Yeah, Brian is someone that I personally consider an expert in international development. He's the president of an organization called Global Peace Network, or GPN, and it works out of Tanzania to support street kids and medical rehabilitation clinics. He graduated as a chiropractor in 1986 and then went to Japan to train in high-level martial arts and get his PhD in neurophysiology in the Faculty of Medicine at Kyoto University. He now teaches at Canadian Memorial Chiropractic College and continues his research there while volunteering to direct Global Peace Network. Today on the Upcast, Brian lets us know what works in international development.
But first, this Upcast is powered by Doctors for Doctors and Nurses for Nurses. We're a Canadian charity that sponsors the medical education of high-potential youth in rural Nicaragua. If you want to ensure everyone has access to quality healthcare, first visit doctorsfordoctors.ca.
Fools rush in.
Okay, Johnny Mercer, fools rush in, because certainly GPN rushed in like a fool to Tanzania. And I guess it's what people in philanthropy do, that if we did the actuarial analysis, we would never get involved in philanthropy because it's a losing proposition financially. It's our hearts which make us get involved in these things. So originally, I guess 2004, 2005, one of my sons went to Tanzania with a CEDAR project, and he was assigned a particular task to perform. But as you're likely to do in that part of Africa, he ran into a bunch of street kids. They would have been about 8 or 9 years old at the time, and all of them said they wanted to go to school. And at that time, to go to school, to go to public school in Tanzania, you needed shoes and a backpack. So I think there were 6 kids. He bought them shoes and backpacks. 2 of them sold their shoes, and 4 of them went to school. And I think those 4 probably have made it all the way through after 10 years. But in any event, had he thought about what he was doing, supporting half a dozen kids for, I guess it would be 10 years. That's a mortgage. Nobody in their right mind would do that. So he wasn't thinking straight. He jumped in and began this project. In 2007, the organization became registered as a charity, and they were having too much success attracting children. The word got around, and the numbers were building up, and they had a request from the community to develop some kind of health center. And so my son approached me and asked if I could find some money to get this going, and I did. And like a fool, I sent him the money, and and then at some point I said, "Come on over, Dad, see what we're doing." So he was so proud of himself. This project really looked like it had legs. And the day I got there, he discovered that one of the people whom he had trusted had been pilfering money, and a very substantial portion of the money which donors had given us had gone to buy a house and a motorcycle for this guy. So that kind of let the wind out of his sails a bit. After the house and the motorcycle, we nonetheless got the clinic built. So we had bought land, we had erected buildings. My son actually made the bricks, built the buildings. And then this gang of criminals had our organization thrown off the property by appealing to someone at the ward level. They said, "No, that's our land, that's our property." So we got kicked off. So we lost the project. And at the time that we got kicked off, we had just received a shipment of medical equipment, which was worth about $250,000. So all this stuff sitting in the clinic, it gets worse and worse. So it was around about that time that a weapon was discharged and someone was beaten to death. There were some discussions, and eventually we got the land and the buildings back. Almost anything which could have been carried off the property and ground up for scrap was. Anything which they couldn't move was vandalized so that it was completely useless. So it was a little bit demoralizing. But we're there, we got stuff going, and things have worked out in the long term. But I got back to Canada about a year later. I'm reading the story in the newspaper. It's in the Globe and Mail. Except it's not us. It's some woman I've never heard of with another organization. So it's like these guys are just cycling through everybody who gets off at the airport. And that's the lesson. In places like Mwanza, where we work, philanthropy is a common local business. And therefore, exploiting NGOs is an industry. And these guys have they have policies and procedures, they have industrial standards that they have to meet. They are really sharp. And when you get off the plane or you get off the bus, the salesperson meets you and says all the right things to you. Please come to my church. I'd like to talk about philanthropy, and I really support what you're doing. And if there's anything I can do to help you, I will. And please feel free to use my name when you're buying property and drugs. So they just every naive person who gets off the plane, they are pulling into this practice. So we have to realize that it's an industry, at least in Tanzania. And for some people, it goes very badly, especially if you arrive as a single young person. And we see this all the time. Kids coming down from Northern Europe and they've collected $500 and they want to give it to some orphanage, and it's never going to get there. So you got to be sharp.
Now, that was Brian's first story that he shared with us about his experience starting a charity in Tanzania from the ground up. So he came out and gave his up-close and personal talk in an intimate setting at the DFD and NFN headquarters.
You might notice that we started with some music there. Now, Brian, in his infinite awesome and wisdom, decided to tailor all of his feedback to song names. So we have conveniently placed some clips in there, and we started there with a clip, Only Fools Rush In by Johnny Mercer.
And to reflect on what Brian said there, with DFD and NFN, it's interesting, right, Mike? I mean, I went down to Nicaragua and sponsored a student and committed to supporting that student through medical school. I was on the hook for about $11,000 personally after the initial funding that I had raised before I made the commitment. And I think back to my commitment, and it was a little slower in that sense. I mean, I wasn't jumping in with both feet. But when I really think about it, I wanted somebody so badly to give me a huge sum of money so I could grow bigger or do something better.
Buckets of money.
And if someone had given me that money, I would have started something bigger, definitely, in that phase. Whereas now I know that slow growth is really the recipe, and it's the way to go to do something that lasts.
Sure, like what happens when you drowned in a bucket of money? No one ever thinks about that. I can think of a bunch of times, actually, that I've rushed into things, even like lunch today. I rushed into fried chicken. Never a good choice for lunch. It's a choice to take a nap at work. So
devastating and very good point to bring up as well.
Is.
In his next story, Brian switches gears a bit and tells us some really important one-offs for running an organization in international development.
And he starts off by talking about the control funders have over charity work, and then addresses the importance of providing services rather than infrastructure. So here's Brian.
That ain't working. That's the way you do it. Money for nothing and your chicks for free.
Oh, dire straits. That ain't working. That's the way you do it. Next line. Money for nothing and the chicks for free. It's a rock and roll fantasy. And money for nothing is a fantasy in philanthropy. If I can paraphrase something which somebody told me when I had my first practice, you don't have a business, or you don't own a business owns you. You don't have funders. Funders have you. And you have to answer to them regularly for every penny. And these days, it is a very businesslike proposition. So we have KPIs, key performance indicators, and outcome measures. And so we have to report, we said we were going to treat 5,000 people, we only made 4,500. They want to know why. So we have to jump through all of these hoops to get the money released. And sometimes the conditions for the money are a little bit odd. Like with the people, where we recently got a grant to support a clean water project in Tanzania, and we got money to hold organizational meetings, but they have to have vegan meals. And for transportation, we're not supposed to use fossil fuels because they don't support the use of non-renewable resources. So I imagine someone sitting in an infinity pool in California. But it's their money. And so you have to do what they tell you to do with the money. And if you don't do that, something which was explained to me is that you're committing fraud. Something that we learned is to never build anything. Putting money into physical things is very risky because money gets stolen. Physical things can degrade. So we have decided that we want to put our effort into services rather than into physical objects. And so the plan moving forward is that we want to get into government clinics and provide rehabilitation services through those clinics, because that's a service that they don't have. They can do the drugs, they can kind of do the surgery, but they can't do the rehab. And so that's what we want to provide. Another important lesson that we've learned is that it's really difficult to deal with local governments, because local governments are at the mercy of the national government. And if we're going to be doing things in a few different locations, the idea of dealing with a number of incompetent and powerless local governments is just too daunting. So what we're doing now is talking to the Ministry of Health and saying, okay, you talk to the local governments, you get them organized. When you think one of them has reached the threshold where they can participate, then we'll go in and do our programs. So it's don't put money in, put services in, and work through the highest level of government that you can access.
There you heard Money for Nothing, performed by Dire Straits.
Reimagined, of course, by Dr. Brian Budgell.
And we can tell that Dr. Budgell is a fan of classic rock. And the chicks are for free, as he says. But also, as he also made clear, neither the chicks nor anything else from funders is free.
Yeah, I really appreciated his lesson of don't build anything, because ultimately that's a huge investment. It's a huge time commitment, and it's essentially a risk for any organization to take on. But what's interesting about this as well is that funders often dictate where money goes, and that's his first point, right? So for some reason now, funders just love building stuff, I've seen. And I've seen this all over Tanzania, just shells of hollow old medical clinics where funders had the money to build them. Organizations went in very excited, and they did just that.
And I'm sure they got their name on it and everything.
Absolutely. And there was no thought or money that was put into staffing them with doctors or local partners or follow through. And now these rural medical clinics are just rotting. I mean, some of them have trees basically growing through the roofs. It's actually ridiculous.
And I love Dr. Budgell's vision of a funder in California. And it's hilarious, right? The details, like the infinity pool that he talks about, and he's drinking his chilled kombucha and just going on and on, in that way. But this funder thinking that everyone in the world should be vegan, right? Which is bizarrely, I don't know, like an authoritarian dictatorship or something like that.
Yeah, and in his last story, Brian here coming up, he said something that I really appreciated. And he shed some light on a very important topic, and I think it affects all of us. It's cultural differences.
And then he spans on things from adapting to the dress code to volunteerism, and even a recipe for making psychopaths. You're not going to find that in Best of Bridges.
Yeah, and that's definitely intense. It ends on a story that I thought was absolutely touching, so let's spin this.
You know me, Ray Charles. Particularly when you're going into another culture, you think you can read people, but you can't. And I remember a fellow writing a book about this in Japan, actually. It's the foreigner's experience. You go there and everything is really unsettling. And then you kind of settle in and you think, yeah, I get it. We're all the same under the skin. We all just want what's best for our kids. And then about 2 weeks later on, you realize, no, it's not that way. And then you work through that, and then you get to the, oh, we're all the same under the skin phase, and you go back and forth about 30 times. I'm at stage 39. We are not all the same. People see things completely differently in Tanzania from people in Canada. And one of the things that people see differently there is that taking advantage of a foreign philanthropy is not a sin. That if you exploit them, that is a bad thing, but if they exploit you, it is not a bad thing, because they are, after all, disadvantaged, and so they have a right to do this. So a segue from the criminal mind thing, you must expect people to hold a different set of values. In Tanzania, people don't drink and they don't smoke and they don't do a lot of stuff that we do. And again, particularly for young people coming there from Europe, it's important to understand that there's quite a different set of values. And consequently, particularly inexperienced people do not fit in very well at all, as a consequence of which they get into a lot of trouble. For example, the way in which people, and particularly women, dress is different in Tanzania from Sweden. And if you dress as you would in Europe or North America, it is interpreted in a particular way, and people get into serious trouble. So you got to really read the culture, and if you're going to go into these places, you have to adapt to that culture. It's the world as it is, not as we wish it were. What do they call it when you're a tourist but a volunteer? Voluntourism? Okay, so they come in for 2 weeks and get their pictures taken with some endangered species, gorillas, populating Facebook, so that other people's suffering becomes sort of a prop for their selfies. It's particularly galling when you see people doing this with children. And I've seen people coming through on these junkets where they will spend 2 weeks loving kids in an orphanage and then screw off to get drunk in Zanzibar. And it's just evil. Pretending that you love children and then leaving them is, I believe, the formula for generating psychopaths. And if it doesn't do that, it teaches them that they can't trust us, and that philanthropy is not a sincere endeavor. So if you're going to get stuck into this stuff, it needs to be a real commitment, not a formula for selfies. So we've got a bunch of boys, and they're getting to the end of the cycle. The last of them are going through vocational school right now. And one of the kids I love is Bahati. Bahati means lucky. So charming guy. So we've taken on a new director recently. And she is a very kind-hearted woman. Sarah? This young woman has been working for 10 years in Tanzania. She actually spends about half the year here, working as a waitress, saves up her money, goes there and looks after kids. So we're supporting him, we're paying his rent, we're paying his tuition, we're paying food money. So we bring on Sarah, and we're going through the list of names that we're supporting. Bahati. Bahati Lucas? Yeah. I'm supporting him as well. So the little bugger's double dipping. He's got at least 2 of us paying for his tuition, his rent, and his food. And it's only like the 2 of us know about it. There may be a half a dozen other people out there. I mean, we've known that this sort of thing goes on, and God bless them, if they can work the system like that. Yeah, it's really good survival behavior in that kind of environment. And yeah, you can't resent it.
The Bahati double dip is also a basketball move, if you didn't know, Andrew.
The song there was by Ray Charles, You Don't Know Me. And that last point was the most important to me. It's understanding that if you take it personally, that when you're taken advantage of, you just won't last. If you have some personal definition of fairness that you really hold tight, I think you're going to really be tested, and it might actually be the biggest risk factor for burning out your motivation if you're starting on a project internationally.
It goes back to that vegan dollars thing that we talked about earlier, right? So a take home for me here is the importance of local partnership. So we don't know what someone means when they tell us something in Nicaragua, right, Andrew? So, what is their subtext when they're talking to us? When we're doing that programming, when we see what is actually happening is hard to discern.
Yeah, it's like that time we had a foreign Canadian translator for a while, and then we switched over to a local Nicaraguan translator, and we got very different information, even though the same thing was communicated to us, and it actually ended up completely changing our decision in working with a local partner there.
So on a related but side note, did you also get chills like I did when Brian says the recipe for psychopaths is to volunteer for a few weeks at orphanages?
Yeah, I mean, that was really intense.
Really intense.
And unfortunately accurate from some stuff that I've seen as well.
Right. Well, Andrew and I have known Dr. Budgell here for a long time now, and his hard work and tenacity to do good is always humbling for me.
Yeah, he's a really passionate and personable guy. I think what the room really liked about him was his ability to go at his own rhythm and in complete honesty as well. He clearly marches to the beat of his own rhythm and really hits his points home. Having been with him on the ground in Tanzania, seeing his patience and his level of understanding was truly inspiring for me personally. And he also mixes it up a bit just by constantly referencing songs too and titles that match the lessons that he was teaching us about. So there was that.
And for all our listeners, if you want to hear everything that Brian said in his live interview with us, you can find the extended version of this upcast on our website, doctorsfordoctors.ca, under the Development Works tab. Our Canadian charity strives to do the best international development work possible, and as we continue to learn, we are sharing all our learnings with you.
And we would love to hear from you too, so drop us a line on our website and find out where you can see our event live.
And now, updates for the month.
In Doctors for Doctors and Nurses for Nurses, we're moving forward with a new great document we have. It's our 2017 operational plan, and it outlines all of our essential tasks for 2017 to keep it legal and really build on a solid foundation.
Speaking of which, I just sent the payments through to our local partners, Foundation of Gene Brugger in Nicaragua, that's the FAJB for short, for our 3 medical students, Brian, Kimberly, and for the first time ever, our 3rd medical student, Brandon. So that's exciting, and they will be starting school this month.
And in other news, our student club at the University of Toronto Scarborough campus is applying for funding to support our project down in Nicaragua through some research funding that's accessible to them as students.
And hopefully that goes through there.
Yeah, and lastly, our website is up and running now at doctorsfordoctors.ca, but we will be getting a new and improved version up soon.
Well, that does it for this month's update on Doctors for Doctors and Nurses for Nurses. Anything else, Andrew?
Yeah, let's give it over to Brian to remind us, even through all this hardship, why we do this work in the first place.
If you look around Mwanza, where we are based, NGOs are like restaurants. They open and they close in 6 months. The model for philanthropy in Tanzania is failure. And so if you're going to get involved in this stuff, you have to be prepared to get knocked down and get back up again. And if you do, you get through all of that crap and survive, as we have. And occasionally do some good things.
And that's everything for this month's episode of Development Works. Thanks for listening.
This is Andrew and Mike signing off, and remember, if you don't make mistakes, you're not working on hard enough problems.